You're listening to Developmental, Property and the Mind podcast, where development industry insight meet mindset with Trafalgar CEO Joe Aboud. Join one of the property industry's most free thinkers as he explores the path to success and contentment.
Tom Forrest, the CEO of Urban Taskforce, is joining us on our show today. G'day, Tom.
Good afternoon, Joe.
How are you?
I'm very well.
Excellent. You know, we've been noticing that you're very active in the media at the moment and always have been. And as I've said before, you know, we welcome that. We welcome all that activity in the media. And your activity is sort of centred around commentating issues on development in New South Wales. But for our listeners who might not know you yet, we'd love to hear a little bit more about how you got started and what has led you to Urban Taskforce.
Well, try not to make this too long a story, Joe, but I started off working actually in the union movement back in the late 1980s. And my motivation for working in the union movement was always to support workers, to support a better opportunity for working people and we were very much what was then known as the Labor Council of New South Wales. It was known as the New South Wales Right of the Labor Party. And back in the late 1980s, the union movement represented over 50% of the workforce. It was a different time for the role and functions of the trade union movement. But it was very much the case that we were never anti-capitalist. We were never part of the far left wing that wanted revolution and nationalisation of banks and the means of production, distribution and exchange. We were always about ensuring that economic growth allows for the cake to get bigger, and then with the cake getting bigger, the developers and the business folk, they get a share of that growth, and the workers also get a share of the growth. By growing the size of the economy, if you like to call it the cake or the economy, everyone gets an opportunity to take a piece of that. And you saw policies like Medicare, universal public health care, compulsory superannuation, improved health and safety, improvements to wages, but also through that 1980s into the 1990s period, you saw great improvements in productivity. And therefore, the business folk, they got a piece of the pie, and the workers, they got a piece of the pie. That's consistent with my philosophy today, working for the members of the Urban Taskforce and for the development and construction industry. It's all about ensuring that there is enough growth and steady growth so that workers can continue to get employed and continue to enjoy the benefits of working in our industry. And at the same time, we're producing a quality output for the community in terms of housing and employment opportunities.
So in essence, it's incentivised to a degree, right? So it was a bit of a win-win situation there between, you know, public and private enterprise, let's call it.
And I've always, in all of my working life, thought that a partnership between employees and employers to deliver a highly productive result is the best way to do it. I've never been one that thinks the public sector does it better. Those that sit there in public service ivory towers and say this is how the private sector should do it miss the benefits that only the private sector that brings, and that is through competition they bring innovation. Through competition they bring the solutions to the problems that are being faced, because they have to do that, otherwise they don't survive in the private sector.
Yeah, it's to encourage that creativity piece, you know, behind it all, to think a little bit outside the square and not do things the conservative way, which is, you know, essentially rather normal in its approach, right? So I think the answers lie beyond normal, you know.
That's right. Part of my work after working in the unions was to go and work for the Sydney Olympic Games for then the Minister for the Olympics, Michael Knight. We had a very, very small public service that did that. The Olympic Coordination Authority was only about 120 people at its peak, and yet it delivered all of the facilities for the Sydney Olympics, which was seen as the most successful Olympic Games ever, certainly at the time, and many would say still today. It was all about really high quality public servants, a lot of which were brought into the public service just for a 4-year period to deliver the Sydney Olympic Games, and then they went away again.
So you poached all the good ones?
We poached the good ones because they wanted the big O word on their CV.
Okay.
It was a big attraction for a lot of people.
Interesting.
And it lifted the quality of public service at that time, because they could see what the people in the private sector were doing. But importantly, the government didn't deliver any of those facilities. Didn't deliver Stadium Australia, didn't deliver the multi-use arena or the Kudos Bank Arena or whatever it's called now, didn't deliver the tennis facilities, the hockey facilities, the archery facilities, didn't deliver the velodrome at Bankstown, didn't deliver the Penrith Lakes facilities, didn't deliver the temporary Bondi Beach volleyball facilities. All of that was delivered by the private sector under the stewardship of the public service. It was the hands-off approach that allowed for innovation, as you say, creativity. That's the sort of approach that has driven my working life and now drives me within the Urban Taskforce and representing its members.
So why is it that there's this great divide between the public and the private sector? And what's the fear that's generated, I guess, by the private sector to the public sector, right, that doesn't allow us to advance or evolve from where they are?
There's always been, in public service and in the planning portfolio in particular, a tendency to mark and punish. And I think that goes, the planners like to have a clear set of rules with a clear set of prescriptions, and they can go through and they can tick the boxes. And if you tick the boxes, you go through the hoop. And if you don't tick the boxes, you're excluded. That makes life really, really easy. Frankly, you could get machines to do that job.
Yeah.
You don't need, and the whole point, I think, in terms of where we need to move to, move back to, is a merit-based planning assessment process. If you have simply tick a box set of rules, you get very ordinary results that don't show architectural flair, that don't give a nod to a business person's creativity.
I mean, we're getting that now. Most of the buildings kind
now.
of look the same because there's such stringent rules, and everything's, it's in essence a cookie cutter approach to design, and everybody's got to stick to a particular, pattern book. They called it the pattern book, right? It exists. It's a document that was, prepared by, consultants that seen a particular way to deliver apartment living and unit design. And fortunately, but unfortunately, depends on what side of the fence you sit on, everything is done very similarly. Everything is done the same all along, with some different facades and some different facade treatments, And that's, in my opinion, counterproductive to evolution. We don't want to end up with the same thing everywhere you go, because one size does not fit all. I'm sure you agree with that. So talk to me about Urban Taskforce, and what's the highest thing on your priority list at the moment?
The Urban Taskforce constantly deals with the changing environment and the planning framework. We're constantly responding to the taxation system and how that punishes or benefits the development of new homes and new properties. We're responding to changes to the planning laws, adjustments to specific legislative clauses like Clause 4.6 of the standard LEP instrument. Most people in the world will say, what is that? But that's actually an important clause, because that's the clause that allows for a variation from the prescriptions that we were talking about earlier. If you want to have more height, or you want to have less north-facing units because, for example, there might be a harbour to the south, then
and surely that's the aspect.
That's exactly right. Any sensible developer and any sensible purchaser is going to want to take advantage of the harbour when it's on the south side of your property, and yet the rules don't allow for that in many circumstances. Clause 4.6 is the very clause that enables that flexibility. So, interestingly, the Urban Taskforce suddenly becomes quite obsessed about how the rewriting of Clause 4.6 might work.
Yeah, I don't know how flexible Clause 4.6 is. It's pretty specific in its approach, and in order to create a variation under that Clause 4.6, it's very, very specific on how to do that, and very difficult in its approach.
And you're completely right, Joe, and that's why, on behalf of yourself and Urban Taskforce members, I've gone forward and called for a review of that very clause, because it's not working at the moment. It leads to the cookie cutter approach. It leads to the tick a box approach we were complaining about earlier. And now we have a review of that clause, and that's why we're focused on it.
And interestingly enough, I mean, that's amazing work that you guys are doing, and I'm a big fan. But it's not so difficult in other states. Talk to me about why you think it's so hard for this to get done in Sydney.
Sydney's slightly different to the other states. It's different. It's different in its history. It's different in its attitude towards authority. It's different in its topology. It's different in its positioning as a city. Unlike most of the other major cities, we're surrounded by oceans to the east, or an ocean to the east, mountains to the west, and national parks to the north and south. We have rivers running through our city, and we have rolling hills, some of them quite steep. That makes just expanding further to the north or expanding further to the west more difficult than it is in Melbourne, where it's just a question of almost drawing another ring and saying that's the expansion zone, away we go. It means that there is a case for there to be consideration of both the environment, the ecology, the aspect, the impact on other people's homes, and that makes it slightly different and it makes it slightly more difficult. But it doesn't make it impossible, and it can't make it impossible. Sydney is the engine room of the whole New South Wales and Australian economy. It's where the big financial institutions come to locate, and it's where the big businesses typically come to locate themselves and to manage their operations, not only in Australia, but beyond that in the Asia Pacific and in some cases the whole world.
And is that because geographically they want to be here? Is there incentives that they're being given? Why are they choosing to come to Sydney?
It's partly the climate. It's partly that we're not rainy and dismal like Melbourne, and it's partly that we're not humid and sweaty like Brisbane. It's partly that we have the culture of both of those places, but we have a better climate and we have a better aspect. The natural beauty of Sydney, no doubt, is very, very attractive to a lot of people. And we've got to be careful as the development industry and as the planners not to diminish that, but to build upon it. At the same time, though, we've got to be sure to be providing the houses for the growing population, because if we don't, businesses will have no choice but to go elsewhere to locate their investments.
So let me ask you, so in the past, the last 50, 60 years, there weren't as many rules and regulations. It wasn't as convoluted and complicated as the planning sort of system and the planning approach is at the moment. And I want to ask you, did you think they did a good job in the past? Do you think they're doing a better job now? Like, what's your take on that?
The Environmental Planning and Assessment Act was introduced in 1979, and at the time it was considered to be world's best practice. It was lauded in 1979. It was a system where environmental issues could be dealt with at the same time as planning and development issues. It was one act that enabled you to take into account all of the different considerations and come up with an answer to guide councils and to guide decision makers as to how to move forward with sensible development, absent of corruption. This was a world-leading document in 1979. The very first state environmental planning policy that was passed, it was called SEP 1, was to allow for merit-based assessment where the specific rules didn't apply to a specific location.
Broader than Clause 4.6.
Broader than
much broader, absolutely.
Precisely right. And it was explicit recognition from the planners of the day, back in the late 1970s, going into the 1980s, explicit recognition that a strict set of rules, particularly in a city like Sydney, where you have such different topology, you have such different geography, you have so many different aspects, a strict set of rules will never apply to any individual site or a specific individual site. And you've got to have the rules in place, but you also have a merit-based capacity to demonstrate that the rules might not apply in your specific case and that there can be a better solution applied. As long as you're pursuing the objectives of the district or of the local council, then you shouldn't be held and bound by a specific set of rules that say we must have a certain number of north-facing apartments, or we must have a certain height, or we must... Those sorts of rules stop sensible innovation and architectural design excellence.
I mean, let's take a design competition that, you know, we're all accustomed to in New South Wales. You've seen many a design competition in your days and in your time. Are you impressed by the outcomes of these design competitions? I mean, does it need a design competition to achieve design excellence or to encourage all this creativity that we talk about? Does it need that? And all this cost, expense and time?
Joe, I don't want to be negative, but when you come to design review panels, design excellence competitions, I am a little bit negative. And I'll tell you why. Unfortunately, the members of the Urban Taskforce typically employ the very best of architects, the top tier of architects, and at worst, the second tier of architects. You've often got on, particularly the local design review panels, you've often got third tier architects, retired architects who have never built a serious or large commercial building, who have never built anything of genuine architectural excellence, who might have done some interesting things for local individuals, but are not really in a position to be making calls on tier one architects who have already prepared something which meets all of the design excellence requirements. And yet, because of this ticker box attitude, they nonetheless feel the need to come in and say, well, you're a little bit too high there, and we don't like the overshadowing you might be creating here, and I think the setback should be a little bit further here, because that's what the rules say. What you get is the exact opposite of a design excellence process. You end up getting the cookie cutter approach that we were earlier saying is exactly what we don't want. Now, in Victoria, you don't have the sort of level of detail of design review as you do in New South Wales, and yet you don't get bad buildings and bad outcomes in Victoria. You don't see people going down the streets of Melbourne going, this is terrible, I hate what they've done here. Well, look, they've ruined our city. Completely the opposite.
Yeah,
you
I
get
agree.
Interesting, innovative solutions. And so I feel here that the design excellence process, because it is so ticker box oriented and dominated by low-level retired architects who are never in the top tier themselves, they're not producing the result that we really need for New South Wales.
Yeah, and so let's go back to the fact that we're so bound up and we're sort of stuck in this minefield of a planning system, which we're all aware of some reforms that are happening at the moment, and we welcome and encourage those reforms, and we hope that streamlines the processes for us and things like that. Why is it that everybody has this mindset?
The Sydney media is tougher. Sydney has always been tougher. It was always the rum corps. It was the convict state. It was the rebellious state. It has a higher per capita homicide rate than Melbourne by almost double. It has always been more hostile, it's more aggressive. If you go and do a media interview in Melbourne, it's like a friendly chat to going and having a media interview with Alan Jones or Ray Hadley or even 2BL here in Sydney. It's a much more hostile and aggressive approach. People just don't trust decision makers in Sydney. They naturally have a resistance, and it goes back to the Irish and English convicts opposing the authority of the British aristocracy in the very earliest stage of the formation of Sydney. You've always had a more polite approach in Melbourne. In South Australia, it's positively congenial. Everyone has a nice little chat together, and they all decide what might be nice to do together, and it's done. In Sydney, it's a more robust environment, and that goes through our media, it goes through our society, it goes through our attitude to politicians, it goes through our attitude to developers. But also, we've had some processes where I think that the Independent Commission Against Corruption has confused in people's minds those very small developers who sometimes don't do the right thing, and they bring down the reputation of the entire development industry. Large companies who are publicly listed, big companies who employ tens of thousands of people, are put into the same box as some bodgy bikie gang guy who calls himself a developer because he can't put bikie gang on his employment register. So he gets called a developer, and when the media go to interview him, they call him a developer. That's not fair. It means that the big and honest companies who have been around for decades are being judged by the behaviour of small fly-by-nighters who just happen to put in the employment column on their tax return developer. And I think that's been the case where a bunch of politicians have been trying to do work for people who are not the core of the development industry and employing those tens of thousands of people and delivering tens of thousands of homes and apartments and employment locations and retail centres each and every year, and yet they're besmirched as developers because of the poor actions of some of our politicians and the poor actions of some of the developers who have been using those politicians to try and get the rezonings or to get the decisions made. It also reflects, I think, what the Planning Act has become. That excellent Planning Act that we spoke about has become over time more and more complicated, more and more prescriptive. And I think when you create desperate people they will do desperate things. And you've seen that a little bit with some of those poorer guys who do the wrong thing on occasion. That brings down the name of us all. What I'm keen to do at the Urban Taskforce is to highlight the positive things that the industry is doing, the high quality and the improvements. There needs to be sensible discussions between the development industry, the financiers, as well as the decision makers, the councillors, and the assessors, so that everyone can know up front what the likely costs are and what the likely outcomes are, so that you can have a feasibility analysis which is realistically informed. At the moment, you have a feasibility analysis based on what you think might happen. And as you say, Joe, you get hit with a whole bunch of extra costs and charges. You get hit with additional fees for state infrastructure, additional fees for local infrastructure, additional voluntary planning agreement charges. You get hit with an affordable housing levy. Value capture levy.
Yeah, all of those things.
You get hit time after time after time after time, and unfortunately what happens then is either the developer goes broke and can't proceed, which means all of the employment and opportunity doesn't arise, or alternatively the cost of the end product just goes up and up and up. So what you have here in New South Wales at the moment, the tax burden on a $1 million apartment, the cumulative impact of all of the taxes, of GST, of the affordable housing levy, of the Section 711 local infrastructure charges, of all of the fees and charges, is much more significant in New South Wales than it is in other states. $1 million apartment, you'll pay about $330,000 in the cumulative impact of all those taxes. In Brisbane, it's only $170,000. In Melbourne, somewhere in between, about $220,000. So you're talking 17% in Brisbane, you're talking 22% in Melbourne, you're talking 33% of the total cost of the end product here in Sydney. So there is a really big additional impost on new home purchases here in New South Wales, particularly when it comes to apartments. So something's wrong here in New South Wales.
Absolutely.
We're paying way more. You could say, oh yes, but we've got more hills and more bridges and it costs more to put drainage in, it costs more to put roads in. That's true, but not to the extent that the developers are being charged. It seems like they say, there's the golden goose, let's just keep taking from it. Unfortunately, as we know from the proverbs and from the fairy tales, if you keep doing that, you kill the golden goose and there are no more golden eggs. I think since 2000 and the introduction of the GST, ever since then, we've seen the beginnings of the undersupply in the Sydney market, which is driving the rising the hike in prices that we're seeing now. It doesn't always, sometimes it ebbs and flows, demand eases off, supply picks up. But for the last 20 years, since 1999, consistently supply has not met demand. There's an analysis by Peter Tulip that was published in the Sydney Morning Herald just today that says while demand has gone up by 3% a year, supply has gone up by 2% a year. Now what that causes is an ongoing pent-up demand. The demand is always there. What happens to those people? Well, either they choose to leave Sydney or the average occupancy in a house increases. The average occupancy in a house in Sydney has consistently gone up since 2000. That is to say, there's more people in each house. The young people are staying in our homes longer and longer. Everyone who's got teenage children fully understands that.
The GST piece is difficult to manage. If you think about it, you can't borrow it, right? Somebody has to cash flow it. And now I think the ATO has moved into a position where during the settlement process, nobody can use that money to cash flow anything at all. And it's actually taken from the proceeds of the settlements, right? So, you know, you've got this amount of money. All of these taxes need to be cash flowed somehow, and the banks are not willing to take any risk on that piece, right? So, you know, that makes it even more difficult. And I think ever since that cash grab was introduced, you're right, the supply has never been able to catch up on top of the planning issues, on top. So, you know, I'm going to take you back a little bit, and you being obviously a prominent voice in the industry, and you're always known for shaking things up in a very positive way. What happens if we don't shake things up? What happens then?
Well, there are some that would say that we don't want growth. We don't want Sydney's population to grow any further, that Sydney's already got too much congestion and Sydney's full. And I say to them, well, that was the attitude taken by some of the states in America, some of the once great cities of America, what are now referred to and led by Detroit as the most notable example, the Rust Belt states of the United States. They stopped growing and they died. They withered on the vine as investment went elsewhere to the new opportunities of Texas and Southern California.
And Texas is flying.
Texas is flying, and it's because it had a very welcoming attitude to growth. I look at what happened in Victoria at the last state election there, and Dan Andrews, Labor leader, said, I'm a proud progressive Victorian who welcomes the growth of our state. I welcome migration, I welcome growth. And even though they had a worse financial position in terms of the management of their state monies, they were in a worse position than New South Wales. They said, we will borrow money to ensure that the infrastructure is put in place to facilitate the growth of our state, because we believe that a growing state gives opportunity for everyone. Now, going back to what I said right at the beginning of this discussion, I've always been driven by the philosophy that you need to keep growing to provide opportunity, to provide a mechanism through which that cake can grow, and then everyone gets distributed a bit of it. Workers benefit, employers benefit, investors benefit, everybody benefits. What I've seen is this a bit of an attitude amongst some. And it tends to be a selfish attitude amongst those who are already in a fairly privileged position. We don't want any more growth because that's going to impact upon my local amenity and my enjoyment of my precious suburb. I say that we should be looking for opportunities to build more housing density in those very suburbs. Yes, it might change the character of the suburb. We've got to be cautious not to change and not to annihilate heritage, and not to annihilate the environment, and not to annihilate people's views of the harbour. But at the same time, if you give the task to a quality developer and a quality architect, such as those that are members of the Urban Taskforce, and you give them some flexibility, they'll come up with a solution which is good for the community, that facilitates growth, that welcomes the new people, and at the same time, by delivering more housing, it brings the prices down. If you've ever been to a marketplace, you know that if you've only got 10 apples and you've got 20 people who wanted to buy it, the price goes up, and eventually the number of people who wanted to buy it will drop down, because not all of them will be able to afford it.
Supply and demand,
it's
absolutely.
Straight supply and demand.
Absolutely. So I'd invite you as well. We touched on something earlier about Texas. It just triggered my mind about Texas as a city and the wider Dallas, Texas and stuff like that, and a place like that. And they have a merit-based planning system where they're encouraging development on a scale unseen in any other state in America. They're absolutely booming in that place. And the merit-based assessments and their approval times, I think they're turning high-rises around in like 2 or 3 weeks for an approval, as opposed to 2 or 3 years here. So I think while I've been in other podcasts inviting members to put a challenge out to a council that would take that on somehow and really try and encourage, these merit-based assessments, or really lead the industry or lead the state by example in trying to achieve a better outcome for the cities, and encouraging, density and development and all that kind of stuff. And to test that notion, we've got the test case. Texas is one of those places, right? So I'd invite the task force to maybe use Texas as an example. I've got a couple of friends that live there. They would advocate for that all day. They'll give us some really good examples of really good planning outcomes and systems that they've got there. And let's lead the charge. I think that's what this place needs. Everyone's afraid to put their neck on the line all the time. I'm willing to do it with you. I
have one reservation, Joe, and
What's
that is
that?
only that what we spoke of earlier in terms of the constraints on Sydney. One of the things you have in Texas and in Dallas and in Austin is the capacity to be able to grow and grow and grow really without any physical limitation. There aren't rivers, mountains, oceans, and national parks that really constrain their growth.
But they'd have other constraints.
We've just got to be conscious not to allow ourselves to be seen as rampant and unreasonable developers. And I'm very keen. But in terms of putting into one of the ways in which the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act has evolved in a negative way is it's forgotten its role as a facilitator of growth. And if you put that back into the clear objectives of the Act, and you make front and centre of the Act that controls all the planning decision makers, that you must take into account not just the objections of the local community, not just the concerns of those that might have once enjoyed a lifestyle in that community and want to have that not change for the rest of their lives, but you said we need to consider the people who might be moving into this area and who can't move in because they're excluded by your decision making. If we took that approach that is so dominant in the United States culture, where we promote innovation and we promote creativity, we don't seek to stifle and regulate it, then we'll see an opportunity to move forward. So I'll take on board, certainly, and with vigour, your suggestion that we look wherever possible to remove red tape and to facilitate growth in a responsible way, and taking into account the particular circumstances that we face here in Sydney, so that we preserve the good, but we also allow for the growth.
So I'm going to take you on a journey now to imagine if we release the hold, right, from the very topics we were just talking about, and we were to choose 5 things that you believed we could change right now that would make a material difference to the pace at which we could move and contribute to growing the cake, what would they be?
5 things. One of them I've already mentioned, and that is change the Act and put as front and centre one of the objectives of the EP&A Act, the importance of economic growth. So that when you're considering an objection, you're also considering what happens if we don't proceed with this development? What happens if we constrain the housing supply, as has happened for the last 20 years since the GST was introduced? What happens if we don't have the growth? And the answer is housing prices goes up.
Well, we know that. We're living it right now, right?
It's there right now.
I mean, the rate at the moment's how much a week or
2 to 3% a month.
Yeah, it's like 2 or 3% a month, you know.
That is unsustainable.
24 to 36% over the year.
That's it.
It's madness.
So, and it can't be sustained. Ultimately, the Reserve Bank or APRA will step in to stop it, and that would be a disaster for the economy more generally.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you put up interest rates, or you stop the flow of money, that has severe impact on the very people we were talking about right at the beginning, the workers who work in our industry. They're the people who end up suffering. And of course, our whole industry suffers and everyone that's involved in it. Okay, and we don't want that to be the case.
So amend the EP&A Act?
Yes, to make growth front and centre as an objective. The Minister already has the power to call in certain types of development. If they're over a certain threshold, if they're of a particular certain type, he's recently made state significant development status applicable to build to rent. Well, why not all residential development over a certain threshold of value? Why not use those powers that the Minister has to fast track and avoid localised, highly politicised council decision making, make it a centralised process, maybe through the Independent Planning Commission as the decision maker, are much broader, because we have a crisis at the moment where, as you say, prices are skyrocketing because there's not enough supply. We've got to get some supply onto the market quickly. The Minister could make a SEP to say any project greater than $50 million will be determined through state significant development planning pathways and determined by the IPC. That's something that the Minister could do tomorrow.
Let me share a quick experience about that, yeah? So I recently went into the department after we had at one of your lunches with Marcus Ray, and he mentioned to us the changes, the reforms around the state significant development for BDR, build to rent, for people that don't know that abbreviation, and also for data centres and recently for warehousing, right? The threshold was 50 million. They've brought it back to 30 million on the data centre and warehousing thing as of a few days ago. Fantastic step in the right direction. So I took the bull by the horns, and I'm always trying to be one of the first people that, you know, goes in there and tries to work with these new processes that have been passed. We reached out to the department. We started talking about a particular project that we have. It was well above the threshold for state significant development for build to rent. And then we realised, wow, we have a problem. We need to still do a design competition. So here we are trying to come up with a fast track system in order to improve and increase the supply of housing to the market. But I've now got another hurdle in front of me that doesn't allow me to move forward with an SSD without doing a design competition. Surely, Tom, we can achieve design excellence without a design competition. This is where it stemmed from when we were talking about it earlier, is, here we are trying to fast track the process, and all of a sudden I've got, go choose 3 architects, add 6 to 9 months to the process. That doesn't help the supply of housing. Why do I need for build to rent a design competition? Admittedly, there's a complication in our site being an opportunity site, and that in order to achieve a higher density, that's what you need. But why does it really, really need that? I'm sure the top firms in this country can achieve design excellence without a design competition. So what I was trying to get at is, yes, we go in there and we're welcoming all of this reform, but being first to market or being first cab off the rank to follow that process, the first meeting I had, I already stumbled across an issue.
And that's often the case, isn't it? Sometimes on a good day, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. On a bad day, it's 1 step forward and 2 steps backwards. And unfortunately, there's been too many bad days.
That's it. Okay, Tom, that was number 2. What about number 3?
So I spoke a little bit earlier about the reintroduction of SEP 1, the very first state environmental planning policy that was introduced after the EPN Act came into place in 1979, was allowing and building in flexibility. You've had some resistance amongst some planners and some council officers to any flexibility, because they say, well, wherever there's flexibility, you might get corruption. You might get people, and there are examples, I guess, where corruption has taken place. Wollongong Council, the Table of Knowledge, for example. Famous examples involving politicians.
But Tom, the panels are in control now. What corruption?
Precisely
I don't get that.
Right. The panels are the ones already making the decisions in this area. They should be able to take into account sensible adjustments that produce a better result. If you had an apartment development in Mossman, if you were required to follow the rules, you would have more than 80% of those apartments facing north, not facing the Sydney Harbour. How ridiculous is that?
That's madness.
And yet that's the very thing that SEP 1 was brought in to overcome. It's where the prescriptive rules are not sensible for the outcome. In so many cases...
And 4.6 doesn't allow you to make those changes.
That's
because
the case.
There are some objectives within 4.6 that are too complex and would never allow you to make vast changes like that.
So what we're keen to do is to either rewrite 4.6 to make it work, or reintroduce SEP 1 to enable merit-based flexibility.
The author might not be happy with you, Tom, of 4.6, but who was that? Do we know?
4.6, no. It was a senior public servant in the New South Wales Department of Planning, but I wouldn't want to name names.
Absolutely.
That wouldn't be fair.
I was just looking for a yes/no answer, but anyway. Number 4?
I want to see an active use of mixed-use development, and that arises from our recent experience of COVID. I mean, the Urban Taskforce has always supported mixed use, less prescription. And the reason for that is because when a local environment plan is established, it's done through a long consultation process about where the future might be. But then external shocks occur. It might be the GFC back in 2008, 9, 10. It might be COVID-19 in 2020. When COVID hit, it fundamentally caused a change in workplace arrangements, which Sydney-siders coped with. And they moved to working from home. The NBN facilitated a change in workplace lifestyle. And yet, as the system currently exists, changes to the CBD development prescriptions will not happen for years. The business leaders, the chief economist of the New South Wales Treasury, the head of Westpac, the chief executive of NAB,
Productivity Commission,
the New South Wales Productivity Commission, the Federal Productivity Commission, the Reserve Bank of Australia, and dare I say the Urban Taskforce of Australia have all said we need to have greater flexibility to allow there to be a change in the building use when there's a change of circumstance and therefore a change in demand. By having a planning system which is so highly regulated and so prescriptive and so opposed to flexibility, we end up with a situation where the circumstances change, but there's no change in the way the planning system allows you to use those buildings. I say, if we were to change one thing right now, it would be to build in flexibility to particularly our CBD area usage requirements and prescriptions to make them more flexible and therefore capable to deal with changing circumstance like COVID-19.
I think the agility would definitely help. We'll get some better outcomes. I mean, in places, like Hong Kong, China, some of the greatest buildings I've ever been in have real variety in their mixed use, the reception for the hotel was on level 80. Right? So you went from ground floor, you get to reception, it's level 80, and then the next 20, 30 floors are a hotel. And then you don't know what's below that, So that gives a lot more flexibility and, I guess, better purpose to certain, floors and certain uses within those floors as you get to greater heights, You just get better aspects, you get better amenity, you get a much better outcome, from that flexibility. And I think the rest of the world is leading the way. And once upon a time, Sydney was leading the way, but I think we're falling way behind right now.
I think we are, but I'm always optimistic, Joe. I think in a city as wonderful as Sydney, and we are blessed with the natural surrounds as well as the built environment that we have, I'm always hopeful that the public servants and the politicians will be driven by both the voice of the development community as well as the voice of the purchasers when they say, we want you to be adaptive, we want you to change. And I'm hearing that voice more and more loudly now. Hopefully the politicians will take note.
Well, hopefully they hear us loud and clear. Last but not least, number 5.
I think we need to establish a voice within the planning system for the future residents of Sydney. The people who are young people at the moment who are looking at the prices of houses in Sydney and thinking, how am I ever going to be able to afford to buy a home? When people are opposing development and opposing apartments and opposing increased density, there needs to be a voice for actually, we want some increased density because that might mean that we can afford to buy a home. The migrants that aren't here yet but will be a central part of growing our economy as we go forward over the next 30 years, where's their voice in the planning system? Where are the people calling for increased employment opportunities that they might take up, increased housing opportunities which facilitate their arrival in our city and their contribution to our economy, which will help pay for the ageing workforce? There are more people leaving the workforce in 2021 than there are entering it. That is, there are more people turning 65 than are turning 18 because of the demographic shift that comes from that big baby boom. That means taxation revenues going down. There are less people working and there are more people not working. More people taking healthcare support, more people taking pension cards for transport, etc., etc. How do we overcome that? We need to have those migrants coming into Sydney. When I say migrants, of course there'll always be some degree of refugees as a humanitarian intake, but really what I'm talking about, that's a minuscule proportion of the total migrant intake. Really what I'm talking about is the skilled migrants that bring skills, that bring education, that bring productivity, that often bring finance and end up contributing more jobs. So far from migrants taking away from the jobs of existing Australians, they're creating more jobs and more opportunity as well as taxation revenue that helps us pay for the aged care costs of that baby boomer generation who unfortunately doesn't have the superannuation to pay for themselves.
It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're just, the very thing that they're afraid of is the very thing that's going to bring them unstuck at some point.
It's exactly right.
They're digging a grave for themselves right now. We know that, and we just hopefully we keep working together to try to create these reforms and keep your hard work up. And speaking about all your hard work and some of the achievements that you've already achieved at Urban Taskforce, talk to us about the achievements that you're most proud of. Within your role at Urban Taskforce, of course.
I'm very pleased that when I came into the Urban Taskforce towards the end of 2019, I said that I was going to be quite deliberate in making our advocacy more of an economic focus. I was successful in having the Premier of New South Wales at the end of 2019, before COVID happened, say that planning reform is her number one priority for 2020. Now, that was before the bushfires, that was before the floods that followed the bushfires, and that was before COVID-19 that followed the floods that followed the bushfires. A lot of things, and yet still, Peter Achterstraat, the former Auditor General of New South Wales and now the New South Wales Productivity Commissioner, heading that role in New South Wales Treasury, was appointed to do a review of infrastructure contributions, that is, those taxes and charges that make things so expensive in New South Wales, and also commissioned to undertake a review of the impact of the planning system on productivity of New South Wales. That is critical. We have managed to achieve establishing a nexus between productivity, employment and growth with the planning system. That's the very nexus that had been eschewed in the decade prior. And the thing that I'm most proud of is now when anyone talks about the planning system, they talk about the fact that it's slow. They talk about the fact that it's costly. They talk about the fact that it's risky. They talk about the fact that it increases the costs for the end user, that is the first home buyer in so many circumstances, or the new migrant that wants to look to get a foot on the property ownership ladder. Now at least we've clearly established that planning is an economic matter, and I'm most proud of that.
I agree with that. I think your involvement of the Treasurer and the Productivity Commission and all that work that you guys did there was groundbreaking for the industry, and we all appreciate that every day. So how do you stay energized? What motivates you on a day-to-day basis?
Positive outcomes, the positive feedback I continue to get from the membership of the Urban Taskforce. We all feared that there might be a drop-off in membership and interest with COVID-19, as I guess we're all scared going into that process. If anything, we've had increased demand and increased interest, and that keeps me certainly motivated. At a personal level, I like to keep my interests diverse. Have a passion for football and soccer refereeing. Have a passion for antique cars and for working on those myself. I find that the best way to overcome the stresses and strains of dealing with politicians and planning and development issues is sometimes to get out and fix something mechanical. And there's one thing I've learned about cars: if you take it apart and put it back together and it doesn't work, it's usually because you've done something wrong. It's not because somebody else has stuffed you, it's because you've done something wrong. Yourself, and I like the accountability of that, and that keeps my mind pure and enables me to focus on something. There's no greater pleasure that when you take it apart and put it back together again and it works perfectly, that gives you a certain sense of satisfaction, which I think which I fully understand and appreciate comes to all of those who work physically on producing a result.
So 3 responses I got for that. Professor Blakely was a referee for gridiron, I believe. Maybe you should try that one day, see if that is of interest. Cars. I can't believe you're into cars. I'm a big collector of cars, and I'm playing with those sort of antique and old muscle cars and various things like that. You and I can talk cars on another episode. I think that'd be really interesting to have. Oh yeah, as you can see, some of the books on the table. Yeah, that's where I started, and then I've become a little bit more diverse in the collection. Mate, that's an amazing conversation we've had today. We appreciate your time as always. We appreciate all of the hard work and dedication you put to the industry, the achievements that you've achieved for the industry, and we thank you very much for that, and we thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Joe. Look, sometimes I think in the hustle and bustle of the world that we live in, there's not an opportunity to sit back and reflect upon where we're going and why we're going there. And I think these podcasts are a very important component of that. And thank you very much for inviting me along. Much appreciated.
Anytime. Either that or talk about cars.
Love to.
Thank you, mate.
Thanks for listening to Developmental, Property and the Mind podcast. Stay tuned for our next episode, available wherever you get your podcasts. Or to talk to Joe, visit trafalgar.com.au. That's TRIFALGA.com.au.